Assalamu alaikum, Habib. How are you today?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very, what can I say, mysterious and alluring topic at hand, and that would be of intimacy. And it seems that everybody is doing it, but not many people are actually talking about it. And so, as a daughter to a gynecologist, I'm no stranger to hearing topics of an awkward nature. So I want to thank you for being here because, first of all, this is such an important topic because there are many people out there who are struggling in their marriages. And if we, in some way, can be, you could say, like a conduit to helping people improve that and overall improving their marriages at large, if they improve their intimate life, that would be an enormous blessing. And then on top of that, we have many single women who are keen on getting married, but they go into marriage with a lot of preconceived notions. And so the aim would be to how do we help single people navigate these maybe difficult topics so that then they are more equipped with the knowledge and skills needed to communicate this with their prospective partner. And so, if you don't mind, I would just like to begin with an intention, Bismillah, that as Allah says in the Quran, "Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahunna," and that is that they are garments for you and you are garments for them, as I know you know that, and that for me is like such a deeply spiritual, sexual, and also psychological metaphor. And so this is where our intention is with this niyyah, this intention to help people improve this part of their intimate life. So thank you so much for being here.
Jazakallah khairan for inviting me to speak on this. I would say very important and not an awkward topic. I think it, like you mentioned, it can be awkward for many people for various reasons, which we hopefully will unpack. But I don't think this topic should be an awkward or uncomfortable one, especially given that within our tradition in the Quran, Allah refers to intimacy. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spoke about intimacy very candidly in several prophetic traditions, and many of our great scholars of the past spoke about intimacy, which again we might delve into. So again, I just think that for many of us as Muslims, although it might be an uncomfortable and awkward conversation, if we actually look at our tradition, it isn't, and it shouldn't be. And obviously, as long as we are speaking about this in a manner which is informative, educational, age appropriate, and also with a sense of higher modesty, I don't see no reason why this conversation should be awkward or uncomfortable because I think it's extremely beneficial. And again, it can help people in terms of if they're looking to get married or those who are in marriage to cultivate a loving and fulfilling relationship. So again, I just think that thank you again for not only inviting me for the bravery to tackle this conversation because I know it's definitely easier as a man to broach this, but unfortunately, again, for many women, it's not as easy to kind of host such a topic. So I commend you
Yes.
for having this conversation. May Allah reward you for your endeavors in this life
Wayak.
and hereafter.
Wayak, yes. And because there are not many Muslim professionals talking about this, people are resorting to social media and to literature and you could say non-Muslim sources because we aren't talking about this in our own communities. So, Habib, I'd like to start with something that I read in an article from the Gottman Institute website. And it said that according to research by sex educators, happy couples attribute only 15 to 20% of their happiness to a good sex life. However, bad sex can feel like a curse, especially when the foundation of a marriage has already begun to crack. The same study found that disgruntled partners said bad sex accounted to 50 to 70% of their problems. So when it's bad, it's really bad. And when it's good, it seems to be almost negligible in a way. And then it also went on to say that socially conservative people are embarrassed to admit they ever have sex, and socially progressive people are embarrassed to admit that they might not be enjoying it, which I would say there's truth in that as well. So, with that in mind, why is studying the art of sexual pleasure so essential?
Well, first and foremost, I would say it's essential because it's part of our tradition. The tradition of erotology or ilm al is something that is an Islamic science that many scholars of the past, from Jalaluddin Asyuti, who was a great scholar from the 15th century, his student Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, his student Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, as well as many scholars that I can name, spoke about intimacy and in terms of studying it and understanding the importance of it, not only for the person themselves, but also to help their partner, their spouse, experience sexual pleasure. And this is something that many of the scholars they were inspired by traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who taught men to ensure that their wives, their spouses are satisfied in the bedroom because it's a right. It's a right that a woman is satisfied in the bedroom. And because and generally for men it's generally quite it's relatively easy for a man to be satisfied. That's not always the case for women, and I would argue that many of our scholars of the past they were more in tuned with human psychology and human sexuality, and they wanted to study not only from the Quran and the Hadith but other ancient traditions from ancient India, from ancient Greek and Rome, as well as from Persian wisdom to understand the nuances and the subtleties of human sexuality again to help their partner experience sexual pleasure and also to preserve their chastity. So it's not as a science that one's just studied just for entertainment purposes. It's to again to enrich their lives and also to preserve the chastity of not only themselves but also their partners. So again, for me, it's really essential because, like you mentioned in the beginning, it's something that many people are doing, but many people are uncomfortable to talk about. And especially within Muslim communities and other faith communities, many of the educators or the thought leaders that speak about intimacy are not coming from a religious or an ethical, from our perspective. So this also can be a problem. So one can be receive information, but that information contradicts their values as a Muslim or someone who follows the Quran and the Sunnah. So this is why, for me, to be honest, it's important because it's not only, and again, when we're speaking about sexual pleasure, oftentimes many people, when they think about intimacy, it's just for procreational purposes. And I would argue that's more of a Christian understanding, which many Muslims have adopted, or they look at intimacy that it's just mainly for the man's pleasure and women are there just to serve the husband. When if you actually look in our tradition, it's actually the opposite, and or it's actually should be mutually beneficial and mutually pleasurable. And I love the verse that you referred to in the beginning because that verse sums up what should be our understandings about intimacy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the husband and the wife, the man and the woman, as being garments for each other, indicating the act of intimacy should be mutually pleasurable for both the man and the woman alike. Now, unfortunately, for in many Muslim communities, including in the last maybe 100, 200 years, many of the books that are written about intimacy and marital rights, it often emphasizes men's right over the woman. And many people, when they view marriage, it's more transactional. It's more about the woman is there to serve her husband in the bedroom and be sexually available. When if you actually look at intimacy from a Quranic framework, it's about being mutually pleasurable, mutually beneficial. And I think that's something that we've lost, to be honest with you, where marriage is seen as again purely for procreational purposes or for the woman to serve her husband, which I would argue that contradicts the Quranic message, which as you referred to in the verse of the Quran that women are garments for men and likewise men are garments for women. So that should be our understanding, and that's why again studying things like erotology or sexology, I think it's beneficial because not only it talks about the sexual problems and concerns that people have, which is very common, also speaks about the ethics. And one of the things that, so just obviously from my background, I studied Islamic law in Egypt, and Islamic law fiqh is very important, don't get me wrong, in terms of understanding the rules pertaining to our actions, what is permissible, what's not permissible, and the like. But one of the things that sometimes people lose sight of when they're studying Islamic law by itself is they lose sight of the ethics and the morals that underpin the Sharia, that underpin the Quran. And that's why sometimes you have Muslims who ask questions such as, am I allowed to marry a second wife without seeking, do I need my wife's permission to take another wife? And it's just like, that's a question that really boils down to one's ethics and character. It's not a question that you need for me, a jurist or a legal scholar to answer that question. So there's a lot of these issues, or does my wife have to, if my wife if I'm intimate with my wife, or if I want to be intimate, she says no, am I allowed to force myself upon her? Now, for me, if you have the understanding of what marriage is, as mentioned in the Quran, that should be based on mawadda wa rahma, it should be based on mercy, love, and tranquility, that wouldn't enter your mind. But because we've lost sight of, in terms of understand what is marriage, what is intimacy, it's just about the laws pertaining my right, her right, very transactional. That's why you have again a lot of these kind of issues that, and again, I think we've lost sight of looking how we look at marriage. Is it based on just rights in terms of rights and responsibilities, or is it based on, as the Quran refers to, mawadda wa rahma and sakina? Is it based on love, mercy, and tranquility? If you have this understanding, then it should be your goal or your aim to try to the best of your ability to try and satisfy your spouse. And likewise, you should go both ways. But again, I just think unfortunately many of us in the Muslim community have lost sight of that understanding of what it means to be husband or spouse. So that's why I think subjects like erotology is extremely important, and that's why for me it's an essential science because it's not only beneficial for the individual, but it's also beneficial for their partner.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that because from what you've said, it's blatantly clear that there is no contrast or contradiction, rather, between religiosity and sensuality. And as you mentioned, the reason why this is happening is probably cultural, right? In the sense of where people are resorting to stringent or literal interpretations of the traditional texts, specifically the text pertaining to fiqh and the sharia, when, as we know, that's just supposed to be like the baseline, like the bare minimum. It's not the ideal of how we should act or behave. So I really appreciate that point about what was the word ethics, which would be adab, decorum, exactly. So thank you for that. So if you could mention, what do you think are the topmost myths surrounding sexual intimacy? What would those be?
Oh, okay. The biggest myth is that one, intimacy is for the man. So it's mainly for the man. That's one of the biggest myths, I think. And I hear that from both men and women alike, that they have this idea that sex should just be purely to satisfy the man and women are there just to serve the man. Second, that it's for procreational purposes only. It can be, but that's not the primary goal, especially from an Islamic perspective. I would argue that the primary purpose for intimacy from an Islamic perspective is for pleasure, as in it should be mutually pleasurable for both the man and the woman alike. And that's why intimacy is something that Muslims not only will enjoy in this life, but also in the hereafter, where they won't be conceiving any children. So, and that's why, again, so that's the second myth that it's for procreational purposes only. The third is the more intimacy that one engages in, the better that the person will be at intimacy or sex. I think that's also a big myth that many people have. And this is why, especially in our day and age in the Western world, where sometimes Muslims might feel because they're not having as much relations, especially those who maybe are unmarried as other people, they might think they're missing out. So they feel that the people who are the experts or the people who are the best at understanding intimacy are maybe those who are engaged in a lot of intimate relations, whether it's casual relationships or hookup relationships. And they're looking, and I would argue that that's because people are just looking at the act of intimacy or intercourse rather than understanding that when we're talking about intimacy, it's far bigger than the physical act. That the emotional side that one needs, that I think ideally you should need, the values that underpin intimacy is just as important, if not more important, than the physical act. Definitely, that's the third part I would say. The fourth is that intimacy is an uncomfortable or an awkward subject, and that it should be shrouded in taboo. But I would argue that that's from a cultural perspective as opposed to a religious perspective. Now, again, I can mainly speak looking at the Islamic tradition. From an Islamic perspective, intimacy in and of itself should not be a taboo topic. It might be a taboo topic in certain cultures or in certain or some people's interpretation, understanding of the religion. But then I would argue that there are other interpretations and other understandings that doesn't have that same mindset or that same viewpoint. So that's why I would say that this understanding or this idea that intimacy in and of itself is taboo or it's awkward or it's uncomfortable. I would argue maybe that's the case in certain cultures, but not necessarily from a religious perspective, because like I mentioned earlier, there are so many examples in the Quran, in the Hadith tradition, in our great literature of over 1,200 years of many scholars writing about intimacy from a religious, and spiritual, and ethical framework. So I definitely would argue that intimacy being taboo is more of a cultural issue, or it's an issue in certain religious interpretation, as opposed to being a taboo topic within the Islamic tradition. Okay, another myth is that Allah would not forgive someone who's committed fornication or adultery. That's a big myth that I often hear from people. Now, again, I'm not condoning zina. We know it's haram. I don't need to hostilize or preach to anyone. But this idea that if someone has committed zina, fornication, or adultery, whether prior to marriage or after marriage or whatever, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not forgive that person. That is totally incorrect. And I think as Muslims, we need to, when we're speaking about, okay, of course you want to discourage people from engaging in such acts, but to make out as if that person will not be forgiven by Allah, or they can't be forgiven, that's totally incorrect. And I think it's important that that message is communicated,
Right, because just by
especially
having that belief, it's putting limitations on God's rahmah. It's
correct.
limiting his all expansive mercy. Hmm.
Correct, 100%. And many people suffer from limiting beliefs, both men and women alike. I would argue that more women suffer from limiting beliefs more than men, especially in relation to intimacy, because a lot of women that I've worked with and I've come across struggle with perfectionism, struggle with this idea that they need to be an ideal or perfect Muslim, when in reality it doesn't exist. And if they have had a relationship prior to marriage or what have you, that this idea that God will not forgive them anymore, this is totally incorrect. So I think that's a problem. And also in the minds of a number of Muslims, men in particular, but also in the community, um, that zina is worse if a woman commits as opposed to if a man commits it. It's not from our tradition. That's a cultural understanding. And and always I'm quite perplexed because a lot of the issues that I come across where maybe a woman is struggling with um, seeking forgiveness from Allah, but men don't have that issue. And I'm wondering why is that? Because if you read in the same Quran, you should both realize that forgiveness is both for men and women alike. There's not this idea that if a woman commits a sin, especially like a sin related to sexual intimacy, that she is less worthy of Allah's rahmah than a man. Men don't generally don't have that. And I'm wondering, where does that come from? Because if you read in the Quran, it's very clear that Allah's forgiveness is both for men and women alike. Allah is aware that we're going to fall, we're going to slip, we're going to make mistakes. But that is not understood by many women, unfortunately. And I think it's maybe the messaging that a lot of the women receive, whether it's from in their communities, their houses, in some mosques, in some lectures, this idea that if a woman is not a virgin, or if a woman has committed zina, then she's devalued in the sight of Allah, she's devalued in the religion. That's totally incorrect, because there's forgiveness that's available. And we have to be realistic, we have to be honest. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was very candid in speaking about such matters. And it wasn't that men can fall and men can slip, whereas a woman has to be perfect. And I think that's problematic in and of itself. And I don't know if that's a myth, but that's definitely a big problem that I think needs to be unpacked. Um, and again, there's more probably we can delve into, but I think that's hopefully that's enough common myths for now on intimacy.
Okay, thank you. So, what are the main problems that people experience, sexual problems, that are a large predictor to divorce? Like this is if this is going on, then this marriage is most likely going to end.
Okay, I'll give 3 or 4, and then I'll expand on them. The first is mismatched libidos. Number 2 is communicational issues. Number 3 is unrealistic expectations. And number 4, which is linked to number 3, is porn. So I'll unpack those 4. So the first one, mismatched libidos or desire discrepancy, is what generally is referred to by sexologists and sex educators, is where one partner desires intimacy intercourse more than the other partner. So this can lead to frustration, resentment, um, many issues. Now, again, this is why, I mean, this is it's fairly common, and I think this is something that one shouldn't be surprised by because not everyone is the same. So even though someone, you can have two people that are married, they're not going to have the same likes and dislikes in terms of when they want to have intimacy all of the time. It might be that might be the case in early stages of their marriage, but it can happen both ways. It's not just always the man wants intimacy more than the woman. It can happen that the woman wants intimacy more than the man. So again, this is not something that is new. This is something that existed even during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where in a couple of instances where a woman went to him to complain that she wanted intimacy far more than her husband, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, his response wasn't to chastise the woman or rebuke her. He called the man to first understand what was the issue. Then he wanted to clarify, are they still in love with each other? Is this something that they can rectify? And what was interesting is that the husband, that particular instance, he wasn't aware that his wife wanted intimacy as much as she did because he was like, we recently just had intimacy, and he used an expression stating that his hair was still wet, meaning they just recently performed the ghusl. And then she actually said, we haven't been intimate for a month, to indicate that that was a month ago. And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, made dua for them and they rectified their affairs. But that's just an example where you can have this desired discrepancy or mismatch libidos, and one partner might not be aware of it. It's not that they're intentionally negligent. It's just that they're not aware. So that's why communication is extremely important. But it's important for people to be aware that this is very common. It's very uncommon for one partner to want intimacy more than the other. Now, there's ways, obviously, how one can go about that. But first and foremost, it's important that one communicates because oftentimes I do come across couples where one partner will be complaining about something, but they haven't actually communicated that their partner in a way where it can resonate with that partner. So, and what I mean by that is that choosing the right time and place, and also the tone in what you're saying, because and also being empathetic, because there might be reasons why one's partner is not interested in intimacy at that particular point in time. But that's very common in terms of like in married couples, amongst married couples, desire discrepancy, or mismatched libido.
In
Yeah,
terms of the
sure.
libido, then, so what if it has been communicated and what would be the solution? What would be the solution? I know of somebody and she is more sexual than her husband, and she's chosen to stay because they've got children together. He's a kind man. And unfortunately, when it came to light in the family that this was her need of hers that was not being met, she was completely ostracized as if she's some kind of sex crazed woman, which is outrageous because if it was a man making that kind of complaint, it would never have been that way. So, what would a person do? What would you advise?
That's a good question. I was going to come to that, but let's go into that.
Okay.
So, in terms of and in terms of like a solution, I won't say one particular thing because obviously number one, it's on a case by case basis. And number two, there should be a lot of nuance when we're talking about these issues. And the reason why I think it's important that even as Muslims, when we're talking about these issues, not to be reactionary and just give a black and white answer in terms of if you do this, this will happen. Because like you mentioned, if we're using the person you refer to as an example, which is quite common, if a woman, for example, wants intimacy, but the husband doesn't is not as receptive as the woman is, and but she still wants to stay in the marriage. She still and she has kids, so it's not as easy as someone saying divorce your husband, and obviously she hasn't got recourse to marry another husband whilst being married. So those simplistic answers that even some people might even say to the man, I wouldn't also necessarily agree with that. Like if a man wanted intimacy more than his wife, some people would just say go marry a second woman. That's not going to solve the problem. Now, if she's communicated that and the husband is not receptive, then it might be a case, and this is quite common that I come across, is that, and this is a reality, but it can come across as quite bad. A lot of men find it very difficult to take advice from a woman, especially their wife. So sometimes it might be a case of he needs to hear that message from another man that he respects. And I use the word respects, not just any man, because he might feel, again, even though his wife is complaining about this, he might, and again, I'll come across this type of issues quite a bit where a woman will express her concern, similar to what your friend is going through. But then when someone that the man respects speaks to him, then he's and also maybe says it in a language or way that that resonates with him, then he has compassion with his wife. Then he would try his best in order to try and meet her needs. So it might be a case of the man, although the woman, like you're referring to your friend, she's communicated with her husband, she might have not communicated effectively. And as much as women are do communicate a lot, I would argue that a lot of women don't communicate effectively in relationships, especially with men. And it works the other way as well. That many people, as men, we know how to communicate with other men, but communicating with women, some even our wives, can be very difficult. Likewise, there are a lot of women who can communicate very well amongst themselves with women, but they don't know how to communicate effectively with their husbands. And the reason why I'm saying that is because even when I speak to therapists, oftentimes one of the obviously main purpose of their jobs, especially family and sex therapists, is to hear both sides and then relaying what they've heard from one partner to the other. So with someone like your friend or someone who's in a similar predicament, I would if either party has communicated but hasn't worked, then maybe try and bring in someone else, maybe that the other person maybe respects or listens to intervene. If that doesn't work, maybe seeking a sex therapist or marriage therapist to try and intervene, because oftentimes you'll find that the person, it's not that they are totally inconsiderate or they don't want to hear what the partner's saying. It's just that they don't like maybe the way that the person's toned, where they've expressed it. They might have used certain language, accusatory language, where they might feel belittled. And especially with men, many of us were very egocentric and our egos are very fragile as well. And sometimes we just don't like the idea that our wife is telling us what to do. I know that can sound really bizarre, but that's just the reality. So if
But
we're looking for a solution, it's finding ways to deliver that same message from someone he would listen to or that will resonate with that man. Now,
Mhm.
also for the woman's side, it's important that a woman, especially the example you gave, where and unfortunately, many societies and communities, a woman will be ostracized or made fun of or demeaned if she's the one who has higher desire than the husband. Now, this is a lot of miseducation or misinformation, because it's perfectly normal for a woman to have sexual desire just as much, if not more, than the man. Now, because a lot of people are not aware of this, especially from a religious perspective, they will look at it like a woman is just there to be passive and there to fulfill her husband's desires and not even initiate intimacy. And this is not from our religious tradition. And this is where I would argue again, if these are people speaking from religious perspective, there are many scholars of the past who believe that women's capacity for sexual pleasure is far greater than a man by 99 parts. So this is something that many of the scholars of the past actually believe, that women's desire was actually greater than a man. And that's why they place more emphasis on teaching men to ensure that their wives were satisfied in the bedroom. So this idea that women shouldn't initiate intimacy or they shouldn't have the desire, this is a relatively new phenomenon, or it's more prevalent in some cultures more than others. And this is where maybe education is important, first and foremost for the woman, so she doesn't feel that something is wrong with her or because she has higher desire than her husband. And it might not necessarily be that her desire is relatively really high. It just might be higher than her partner's. It might be that her husband's desire is is not is quite low. So again, it's all relative, and this is where education is extremely important. Um, and then the first is obviously try and find someone to communicate to the husband in this case, or family therapist or sex therapist. Then obviously want to educate themselves and get rid of these some of these maybe limiting beliefs that something is wrong with you um um if you have like a high desire than your partner. And then third is maybe to actually look, and again, I won't speak about going to divorce right now, but just look at what are the other options, because if you've communicated this to your husband, or if you've got someone, if you've got or he doesn't want to see a therapist, or you've been to a therapist, he's still not interested. You realize that, you know that you haven't got the issue, but he still doesn't want to um, satisfy your needs. Then you have to look at, okay, what are the other alternatives? If it's separation, if it's going to be okay, you're just going to have to maybe go about satisfying yourself for a period of time. These are all possible options, and the reason why I'm saying that is because this idea that you just have, if you do this, you'll get a solution. That's not necessarily the case, because we're dealing with human beings, and everyone is complex. They've got their own issues and personalities, and I don't like to. I just like to give different options so people can know what works for them, but at the same time, so they don't feel they're stuck in a rut. But also at the same time, to understand that what many people are going through, other people are going through the same thing. They maybe are not vocalizing it. So, and not everyone has had the best solution, to be honest with you. So I don't like to give fairy tales as well, but try and be quite realistic. But then it's kind of understanding, okay, I'm in this marriage. Okay, maybe my intimate needs are not being met as much as I would like, but I'm also getting X by other things in my relationship or my marriage, which is, and then if that's enough for you to feel to be content, that might be enough. Because like, you get it from both sides. I think so. So that's why. But if it's the case of obviously the woman is not being receiving any intimacy whatsoever, again, that's obviously a problem.
Hmm.
If she's not receiving intimacy as much as she would like, then I think that's something that maybe one can manage the same way. When I speak to men, I tell them the same things where a number of brothers will reach out to me say that okay, my wife is not doesn't want to engage in intimacy as much as I would like. In the beginning of the marriage, it was great. Now, 3 or 4 years in, after children, she's not as interested. What do you think I should do, brother? Should I get a second wife? I'm like, why are you looking? That shouldn't you shouldn't be jumping to getting a second wife because your excessive needs are not being met in your current marriage, and there's no quick solution. And yes, you can get someone to speak to her, but also it's about being realistic. So that's why again, I don't like to jump to with the brothers anyway. Don't get a second wife to solve your problems because you've got excessive lust. And likewise, I don't like to say to the sisters straight away, go to divorce because your intimate needs are not being met. Because you can still manage, but try and find other things if you can try and resolve it. If not, then it might be a case of okay, we might have to make do until hopefully um maybe your desires drop somewhat, or your husband or your partner kind of like realizes actually, no, I want to try and make this a priority.
Habib, if a man had to ask, well, what's the big deal? What's wrong with me taking a second wife if I have a high libido and my wife totally is not interested?
There's nothing wrong with polygamy in terms of plural marriage in and of itself. I mean, I wouldn't, of course, I'm not going to say anything is wrong with polygamy, but to take a second wife because what your needs are not being met. The reason why I would just say just be careful with that option is because it's going to cause issues. And I see this a lot because a lot of brothers they think it's like a quick fix. Like, let me take a second wife and then okay, my needs are going to be being met, but your first marriage or your is going to might be destroyed. And especially the way brothers go about it. And especially if, like, for example, if their needs are not being met with their first wife, have they exhausted all of the options to try and see if they can resolve that issue? I think that in and of itself, I don't think that's a satisfactory reason. Everyone's different. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. Of course, I can't say that it's wrong to take a second wife, but to take a second wife just because your needs are not being met by your first wife without exhausting all of the options and also without having some compassion, because this
Right. So it's a
idea that again that
process.
marriage
Yeah.
it's
So
a
you're saying
process,
that
and
it's
I
a
think
process. Exactly. It's not just like, okay, well, then I'm just going to go and do this rather than seeing it through and exhausting all of the avenues.
correct, and it happens quite a lot. There's a lot of brothers who look at, and again, it's like so. Then the second wife or the subsequent wife, is she just there just to satisfy your needs? And then if your needs aren't being met, then what do you want to take a third wife? And I think again, a lot of Muslims, the way we look at polygamy is quite immature, as in it's just about intimacy and it's just there for a woman to satisfy the man's needs, not realizing that marriage, whether it's a monogamous marriage or polygamous marriage, should be one which is based on it being a firm commitment between obviously two individuals in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's a responsibility. And if we look at marriage, whether it's monogamy or polygamy from that perspective, then it wouldn't just be a case of, okay, my needs are not being met. I'm just going to take a second and third wife. So again, because I see it a lot, and people, a lot of the brothers in particular, are not aware of the harms that it can cause for not only for the children if they have any children, but also for the emotional state and the spiritual state of the first wife. I just think brothers need to be a bit honest with ourselves in terms of looking at polygamy as a short fix to solve our excessive lust desires, So that's why I'm just saying, because, and again, I mean, some people sensationalize, polygamy or romanticize polygamy in the sense that, if every man had two wives, no man would cheat, no man would, be unfaithful. And that's not a lie. That's not the case. Even during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in early Muslim communities, polygamy was allowed. Men still cheated, men still were unfaithful because oftentimes men, if we're honest with ourselves as men, a lot of men just want intimacy without the responsibility. They want sex without commitment. It's not that they want a second wife, they want a sexual partner. And that's not how Islam teaches or instructs or the whole understanding of why polygamy was allowed. And polygamy in and of itself, I don't like to say it's a right. It's an allowance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to some men. Polygamy is not a right for every man. Allah made it very clear that if you're, and everyone knows the first, well, a lot of the men, we know the first part of the verse in terms of um فَانكُمَا طَابَ لَكُم مِنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ. And we stop there. But with the last part of the verse, that if you fear you cannot be just between the wives, then marry only one. It's very clear. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if you fear, so if you're afraid, if you think you cannot be just, and that doesn't just relate to in terms of how scholars explain that verse. It's not just about being fair financially, but also emotionally. It's also physically as well. So again, it's for someone to be polygamous, you have to be financially responsible, you need to be emotionally intelligent, and you need to be physically capable. And the reality is a lot of men aren't able to fulfill that criteria. And that's why many of the scholars of the past, the classical scholars like Ashafi and Noe and the like, said that it's actually preferable for a man to just be with one wife. That is the sunnah, unless there's an actual need. Now, again, a lot of men, how we even myself in my younger years, how you interpret that is that no, I can be fair because of my physical, because I'm, it's just a very egotistical. But when you actually really look at it, especially the the climate that we're living in now, especially in the Western world, it's like a lot of brothers do not have the capability to be just and to be honest and to do practice polygamy with integrity. And I just think that as Muslims, because oftentimes we look at polygamy as just a way for a man to relieve his sexual desires. That's not the intention and the aim behind polygamy. And when I started to study the religion, and I saw how people were using the religion, using the Quran to justify really cheating, and just or justify unethical behavior, justify lying and manipulating women, and using certain verses, the hadiths, and taken out of context. That was when I was just thinking we're in a big problem as a community. Like when people are, and these are people that are knowledgeable as well. It's not just people that are completely ignorant, but people just use again verses from the Quran. And I think it works both ways. A, obviously the people that are manipulating and abusing um religious texts, but also because a lot of women do not know their rights. They do not know what the religion actually teaches. So because they believe that polygamy is a God-given right to every man, and I have no say in the matter. The whole idea that a man can marry another woman without informing the first wife or seeking her permission, they're not aware that many scholars of the past they said that a woman it's well within a woman's right to, if she wants to stipulate in her contract that a man cannot take a second wife or else they'll divorce. Like a lot of these things, a lot of women are not aware of because people bring out the verse from the Quran and say no, it's a man's right. And if you go against, you're going against Allah and His Messenger. And again, this is it's a form of spiritual
That's
abuse. Again,
spiritual
like a
manipulation. Now, as I was going
spiritual
to say, spiritual
manipulation.
manipulation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that is it's very disheartening because a lot of and it's obviously mainly brothers that are doing this, they know better. But they wouldn't allow it for their sister, their daughter, or their own mother. So it's just a case of like if you're going to, I just tell brothers are like, if you're going to commit zina, go and commit zina, but don't use the religion. I'm not saying do it, but it's like don't use the religion or don't manipulate. It's like lying is haram, we know that, but lying on the prophet is even worse. Like a lot of brothers have no issue, um, like playing around with polygamy because it benefits them in some respects in this life, not in the hereafter, of course. But when it's issues pertaining to fulfilling women's rights and being ethical, moral, like ethics and morals behind what Islam stands for, how the Prophet peace be upon him was, and being the trustworthy. Those parts of the Sunnah we kind of neglect. And the Sunnah of the so-called Sunnah of marrying four wives, that's something that again a lot of brothers are um, well versed in, but and a lot of them are really misinformed because if you actually read and study the tradition, it doesn't give that allowance the way many Muslims understand or misunderstand the tradition.
Thank you. Back to you mentioned communication.
Yes, communications that we kind of touched up with um speaking about the mismatched libido. But yeah, communication, because I was saying that from my experience and the people I've worked with, a lot of people do not communicate effectively. And again, everyone is different. If you have um so we're talking about communication like in terms of between the husband and wife, right? If there's an issue, right? So they had to resolve that. I know, so I kind of went off on a tangent, but yeah. So in terms of communication, like I said, there are different ways of communicating. It can be obviously verbal, non-verbal. Could be, some people prefer you put things down in writing. I definitely encourage people not to communicate, especially their grievances during intimacy or right after intimacy. And again, this might sound quite strange, but some people lack tact in terms of when they should vocalize their issues. So just using the right time and place. And again, know your partner. Oftentimes, I definitely wouldn't recommend having those discussions during act or straight after. Um, and again, the choice of words, not using accusatory language like where it's blame and say you didn't do this, you didn't do that. It's more about we or how can we achieve this? How can we overcome this issue so it looks like it's more of a collaborative issue? And again, just being aware of your partners and their sensibilities because everyone is different. Some people don't mind a very forthright language and say direct instructions, both male and female alike. Other people are a bit more sensitive. So again, it's just having that ability to read the room and knowing what works because you want the same result, but it's just a case of how to get there. And that's why I just think that, especially if one is not used to communicating effectively, that can be very difficult because some brothers, like I said, they'll speak with their wife as if they're speaking to another brother. And some women, again, they might think or want to communicate with their husbands the same way they might speak to their sisters or one of their girlfriends and think that he will have the same understanding. That we're very different, but you just have to have some tact in the way you're communicating.
And then you mentioned unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, so unrealistic expectations, this is very common for men and women alike. And this is not to have a go at anyone. It's just that it's very common, especially if someone hasn't been in a relationship or married or what have you, will have certain expectations that can be quite unrealistic in terms of how marriage should be and how intimacy should be. And that can be fueled from pornography. It can also be fueled from romance novels or Hollywood movies. But as much as porn gets rightly so a lot of flack, romance novels and Hollywood movies and a lot of friends who exaggerate, if I'm honest with you, because a lot of people can be very colorful in terms of when they're speaking about their intimate relations. Men often exaggerate more than women in terms of, according to studies, according to performance, but also women can embellish their relationship as well. So if a woman, for example, has not been in a relationship before, she's not married, and she's hearing from what other people have said or social media, and this has happened. This isn't just a recent phenomenon. This has always been going on. She might have these expectations that this is how my husband should be. And then naturally, of course, when she gets into a marriage, she's comparing her husband in terms of his how romantic he is, how he is in the bedroom, compared to what she believes is the standard based on what she's heard, either from her friends, what she's watched on TV or movies, or from what she's read in novel movies or read from the 50 Shades of Grey or what have you. So this is something that happens from both sides, from both men and women alike. Men also, again, having unrealistic expectations, oftentimes from what we've watched or heard, especially from porn, can give these unrealistic expectations in terms of what is good sex, what is good intimacy, how is someone in the bedroom, and then you have all of these assumptions that you're going into the bedroom with, and then or your relationship or marriage, and then you're expecting your partner to fulfill each and every one of your desires. And also, there's this idea that a lot of it is from modern Western society and Christianity that your partner being your soulmate should fulfill each and every one of your desires. And this is quite a hard task. This is something which Esther Perel, she speaks a lot about. She's a um, Belgian psychotherapist, psychologist, and she speaks about that. It's like a recent phenomenon in the last maybe 100 years that your soulmate is supposed to be your best friend, your intimate lover, your companion, your confidant, your financial advisor, all of these things like that. Generally, that wasn't the understanding in ancient societies. Whereas if you have these expectations for your like spouse, it is unrealistic to be fair. So you put them on such a ridiculous, you have such a ridiculous pedestal that you want from your partner to not to fulfill again your physical needs, your emotional needs, your spiritual needs, all of these, which is very, again, it's unrealistic and naturally will lead to disappointment. So if you have more realistic expectations, then you're more likely to be satisfied. But if you've got unrealistic expectations, which many of us have, both men and women alike, then naturally it can lead to an unfulfilled relationship. So that's why I do try and encourage people to question some of their belief systems in terms of what they want from a marriage or what they want from a partner. And because you can have all of this list, this just you can write it down, just say there's 10, and then maybe it might be a case of questioning not only yourself but asking others how realistic all of these things are. And you might have to prioritize because, and again, if this is someone that you're not in a, married, then obviously the list might be lengthier. Whereas obviously now you are in a marriage, it's okay, I'm stuck with this person. I don't like to use that, but that's how you might feel. Then it's a case of, okay, you might want your partner to improve on certain things, but how much of those things can they realistically do? So it might be a case of if you've got 5 things that you want your partner to be more attentive, to be more romantic, to memorize the Quran, to be, considerate in the bedroom, to be very good with the children, or according to your standards as well. Those 5 things that might be very difficult for someone to achieve, especially within a couple of years. So maybe be more realistic and say, okay, at least let me whittle it down to one or two, and then you work from there. And then if that person, your partner, hopefully has achieved, one or two from that list, then you can feel a sense of fulfillment. And then okay, then let's see if they can improve on the third, fourth, and fifth. And likewise, it goes for the other side with men as well. I would just say that sometimes, like I said, with these unrealistic expectations, it does way more harm than good. And some of it is self-inflicted, and others is more things that we've consumed from social media or from our friendship groups, without us realizing that we have these expectations that are unrealistic. And I'm not saying that you should go into marriage and just think that, okay, I'm just there to procreate and I'm just there as a woman to lay back and think of England, let him do his thing. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. It should be based on, like we mentioned earlier, mawadda and rahma. It should be based on love and mercy. You should feel safe within your marital home. There should be romance. That's great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. You are entitled to intimacy. You're entitled to pleasure. But all of the extra stuff, I'm not too sure about that. Just be realistic. That's what I would say. Just be realistic. And again, because people that are generally in healthy relationships, they generally won't talk about some of the stuff, the sacrifices that they make. But people will oftentimes talk about their wants and their desires and what they expect, and especially nowadays on social media. So that's why I would just say maybe it's definitely advisable to temper one's expectations.
That's why I really think that premarital education is so essential because people are not taught this kind of things. It's so important. And then they might have to learn in their marriage, which ends in a divorce, and then try a second time around. But I think we could mitigate that.
But do you think it's because I don't know how else to say this, but marriage isn't sexy from a lot of people. Dating is sexy, and what I mean by that is that if people are talking about dating or premarital or finding the one, there's a lot of stories. It's a lot of interest. But when one's married after the wedding day, generally it's not going to excite listeners. Apart from, oh, we've been married for 15 years, we've been married for 30 years. Other than that, that's one of the that's maybe I could be wrong. I think that might be one of the, because if you even look online, there's a lot of content around like relationships, or even in the Muslim space, premarital finding the one in terms of the courting phase, because there's a lot of stories that one can tell. But in terms of the reality of a long-term, healthy, sustainable marriage, there are going to be compromises that works both ways. That's not, to someone who's outside of that marriage, that doesn't sound exciting and sexy, but that's also part of the bedrocks of what makes that marriage healthy
But
and sustainable. Sorry,
right,
go
but
on.
that's why I'm saying that I think that this should be starting before marriage. And I think that
Yeah,
there would be an interest, just that we don't have an opportunity, Like I've been thinking for a while, there need to be Muslim man coaches who can coach men how to be manly and seductive and sexual, and there need to be female coaches how to be womanly and feminine. This is the whole topic
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
polarity, which we can come to later, but it's a huge complaint that many men are a little, you could say, not as manly, and the women are just too aggressive, and then that affects the sexual dynamic. I've heard several men complain about this. So, Allah alam, I'm
That's a
just
good
left
that's a
into,
good point. Can we
yeah,
expand on that? Because
yeah, yeah.
not to push back too much, but one of the reasons I think why that's an issue and is that, okay, especially from the man's side, men who are in good marriages, healthy relationships, they won't feel a need generally to talk about that to anyone else, to teach anyone else. Did you understand what I mean? As in, if you prioritize your wife, if you're doing your best to ensure that she's satisfied, if you're doing your best to romanticize her, to please her, to make her a priority ultimately, well, you don't need to go into details. You don't necessarily need to teach that to other men, but you wouldn't even anyway for a lot of
Okay,
men.
well, someone needs to do it. It's a sadaqah jariyah. And I'll
No,
tell you
I
what
hear you.
another problem, but the other problem
Yeah,
is that, the hadith that mentions that it is sinful to disclose what is going on in the bedroom with your spouse.
yeah,
I understand the hikmah, the wisdom of that, right? Because
yeah.
you are a garment for your spouse, so you're protecting your spouse. But on the other hand, it leaves this world so unknown. And then people have to
Okay,
resort to these non-Muslim platforms and figure stuff out themselves. And they might figure things out too late when the marriage is already at its end. So I would like to see,
correct.
yeah, more in our communities where it's with this dignified dialogue from men speaking to men and women speaking to women, where we are addressing these issues.
Okay, correct. But okay, no, that's a good point. But then even with the non-Muslim dialogues, I don't come across many, and please educate me if there are that you know of, where men are having those. I see it from the women's side, but not many men. Again, because so for example, if as a man, if your wife is not, for whatever reason, she doesn't want to have intimacy with you, right? And it's gone on for 6 months, 3 months, and then you're just because you prioritize her, you love her, you're going to be patient. That's nothing to brag about, but until she's ready, until she feels safe and secure with you, or maybe she might have gone through something or whatever, might be hormonal issues. Now, that's something that I'm sure you would agree is praiseworthy, right? But as a man, you don't need to disclose that. Do you understand what I mean? As in, he won't feel he needs to disclose it, not because of the hadith, because he's doing what he should do because he's prioritizing her. The same way you shouldn't expect to congratulate a husband or a father, sorry, for picking up his children. You're supposed to do that. That makes sense.
Yeah,
It's
it's
because
he's
that
doing his
it's
job.
where
It's his
it's
duty.
doing his job. Where it's seen as the norm, it's not the norm. That's why it is congratulated. Oh, he's an attentive father. He's babysitting his children when that's what he should be doing. I think what the issue is, I think in many of our communities that a lot of men we don't prioritize our wives. We prioritize our children and our mothers, and that's spoken about, or not our wives. As in they're not seen as they're prioritized in the sense of we need to keep her away, no one can see her. Other than that, but in terms of prioritizing her feelings, prioritizing who she is as a woman, not because she's the mother of your child, but who she is, you don't really have many men talking about that. So we appreciate our wives for being the mothers of our children, what they've done for our children, and because they looked after our mother. But in terms of for who she is, for her intellectual achievements, for how she's helped us. You don't really hear men generally talking about that, and that's also non-Muslim spaces as well. If I'm honest with you, I think there's definitely a problem amongst. I was going to say the manosphere because that's a problematic term. It's definitely an issue amongst men in general, generally, because unless you've seen it yourself, in terms of what it means to be a good, attentive husband, men generally won't disclose that in terms of how they were there for their wife, which I think probably definitely, especially men who haven't come from a home where they've seen it with their parents, they probably don't know what it means to be an attentive and loving husband because generally, like I said, in male circles, that's not really celebrated. What will be celebrated amongst men is, oh, this man has multiple wives because we all equate he's a real man because you can measure that or quantify that. But in terms of is he a good husband? Yeah, it could be have two wives, three wives, that's fine. But is he good? Is he fair to those women? That's difficult to measure. So that's why again it's very difficult, like I said, to broach because of yes, like the hadiths I mentioned, you shouldn't disclose what goes on in the bedroom, but also as men generally, those type of conversations aren't kind of seen as like quite sexy. Whereas if you were to say, "Oh, mashallah, this brother's got two eyes, three eyes, mashallah, everyone's congratulations. How did you do that?" You know. So, but in terms of what it means to be upright, ethical, moral man, generally, again, like I said, it's very difficult, and that's why for me personally, for if especially for men, or even if you have witnessed that in your home growing up, the Prophet Muhammad peace be upon him is the example because we have very intricate and detailed details of his intimate life that we can learn from and that we can aspire to be like. But I think a lot of our models in terms of what it means to be a man or a husband are problematic. That's the issue. So we look at models who are just having, but in the male side, men have who are virile, so they have multiple women, whether it's by way of polygamy or what have you, have multiple children. So again, everyone will congratulate that. But in terms of how it is as a husband, generally you wouldn't know that unless you speak to the wife or hear from the wife. Because if I could speak to the man, of course he would tell me he's a great husband. So I provide for her. But he's mainly talking financially, he's not speaking about emotionally. And you wouldn't know the reality unless you hear from the other side or unless you witness that. And because again, like I said, generally, I don't think a lot of men will kind of disclose that, especially in public platforms. Maybe in a um in a private sitting. You use that's why again, someone like the Prophet, of course, is the best example. But a lot of men, like I said, a lot of men have unrealistic ideas into what it means to be a husband. It's only when you speak to them one to one, then you realize, oh, you know what that guy was saying? He's just full of crap.
I still think it's a good business venture, and I think you would have many young men joining such a class. Really, I think you should go in tandem with premarital counseling. In fact,
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I don't think. Sorry, I wasn't um knocking what you were saying. I
no
wasn't
worries.
saying. But I definitely think I just see that there's definitely more, which is good. I definitely think there's more spaces on the woman side of that. But I'm not really seeing much. And I think, especially with these issues, we need buy-in from both the men and the women because again, we're marrying each other. It's not about just empowering the women and not empowering the men. And this is where I think you have a lot of women who are emotionally more mature and more educated about these sciences than the men are, and that's also a problem. So if the women are really advanced and they have the language and they can talk about whether it's the five love languages, whether it's the attachment styles, all of these great things which are wonderful, and then she's asking as potential spouse, "What's your love language?" And he's like, "What are you talking about? What's your attachment style?" That's also a problem. So we need to find a way to make these knowledge that knowledge, which is important, where men also can understand it so they can have these conversations with women. But there's no point women having those conversations just with other women because they're not
Right,
marrying
it
each other.
has to happen in tandem.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's happening in tandem. And that's because if I'm honest with you as well, and this is something that when I speak to women sex educators or some content creators or what have you, is that they have a quite a difficult time reaching men. And again, some of my advice is again, you have to speak to men at the level that they're at. And it sometimes can come across as quite crude. It can come across sometimes as quite playful. But this is something how to resonate and how to direct men and how to get men's attention. Sorry. So if I'm going to have a workshop or a discussion, I call it like the attachment styles or the importance of intimacy or love languages. That's great, but that's really going to attract women only. So you might have to use certain play on certain words to attract men's attention, and then you can actually educate them. And that's just a reality. Now, some people might find that a bit, but again, it's just if you're looking at results, you have to know you have to know your audience. And if you want to get men's attention, I can't I, I can't market myself or market an event as if I'm speaking to women when I'm trying to attract men. I just understanding that, you know.
Well, you've got lots of work to do, Habib. And then moving on to the last point that you had, which we went on many tangents, but which was the one of the predictors of divorce. The last one was pornography. Would you like to just touch on that?
Yes. Yeah, so whether you want to call it porn addiction or excessive porn use or porn consumption, there's a lot of terms that I, I find the term porn addiction quite problematic in of itself. But that's definitely an issue in terms of what's leading to divorces. Um, Potentially, especially on the men's side, like excessive um use of watching of pornography, which can lead to unrealistic expectations. It can lead to um performance issues porn-induced erectile dysfunction. It can lead to obviously the woman feeling that she's been betrayed, that she's that the husband has cheated on her, and obviously can lead to resentment and it can end in divorce. And there's also some men who obviously, because they've watched a lot of porn, they want to reenact what they've watched, or they want to start um or they have the expectations that the wife should replicate the porn star. So there's a lot of problems, but porn is definitely a lot of it. What it comes down to, it's not porn in and of itself. I will boil it down to lack of sexual discipline, because there are some men who watch porn, and then that leads on to having actual affairs, whether it's visiting escorts, prostitutes, or sleeping with someone else, or trying to, have like secret relationships. Others who are just content on watching porn and think, okay, porn is at least I'm not cheating. That's how some men will view it. Um, but generally, I think a lot of men, they know that it's wrong. And again, especially if it's something that you're doing it in secret, or you're doing it away from your wife, and she doesn't know about it. But a lot of men do, if I'm honest with you, we don't see porn as big deal, because it's seen as just something that is between me and obviously Allah, but Allah knows my weaknesses. That's how we can rectify it or justify it in our minds. And as long as a wife doesn't know, then there's no harm, no foul. But it's when men maybe probably think about the harm that it can do to themselves, that's the reason for them to stop. Because sometimes people stop doing something because they think about someone else. Sometimes they do something because they know it's not good for themselves. But porn is definitely one of the biggest reasons why marriages are ending this. And I wouldn't say just again, like I said, porn in and of itself. I think a lot of it ultimately comes down to a lack of sexual discipline, because um but some men, like I said, unfortunately, something even when I do polls and I ask um how many men do you think struggle with porn use? And I will say like over 80%, 51 to 80%, 20 to 50%, or less than 20% of men. And constantly, I'm always, when I'm part of these polls, it's always like over 50%, over 80%. That's generally like, so it's something that is definitely very prevalent. And if I'm honest with you, like I said, a lot of men, we don't see it as a big of an issue as maybe women do, because we're not maybe thinking about the emotional harm that it's done to the wife who feels betrayed. And also the side of the men, they sometimes look at it like, at least I'm not committing zina, actual zina, or it's preventing me from doing something worse. So it's how do you help, again, especially men that are watching, but I know women do watch it, but how do you prevent a man from himself not wanting to watch porn, from policing himself? I think that's a big, and I think also if I'm going to be honest with you, some people, they, because I don't do a lot of work on like overcoming porn addiction and stuff, because think some of the material out is either one way or the other. It's two extremes. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes when I hear people using like obviously like the problems with porn, again, I'm not talking about from an Islamic perspective, we know it's haram. I'm talking about dealing with the issue. People will kind of go to one extreme and make it out like if someone watches porn, they're going to be addicted, they're going to suffer from erectile dysfunction, and they use the worst case scenarios, that some obscure cases that someone, I've heard some religious preachers say someone's died from porn. So like the really worst cases. And the reality is, if people who are like somewhere in the middle, shall we say, they will be like, okay, that's like they will lose trust in the speaker. It's the same way like if someone said, don't drink alcohol, because if you drink alcohol, you're going to become an alcoholic, and then you're going to be a heroin addict in 2 weeks' time. It's like that's not, if you're speaking to 12-year-olds or 5-year-olds who maybe not tasted alcohol, maybe that works. But if you're speaking to adults who may have had a drink or two, or more than a drink or two, just using that, saying that rhetoric, it's not going to be effective, because the person is going to know that that's not true. You could say it could lead to alcoholism. It could lead, which is true. Porn could lead to erectile dysfunction. But to say that anytime someone watches porn, this is going to happen, or anytime that, or they won't be able to perform, or that, it's like that's not actually true, because there are many people who do watch porn, or functional porn consumers, but they're still happily married, so to speak. Does that make sense? So that's why it's a way of how can you. That's why I've always been thinking, okay, if you're going to really address this, how can you make porn consumption despicable in the eyes of porn consumers, so they themselves don't want to watch it, not because they're not watching out of fear of their wife finding out or or their child finding out because in this day and age with mobile phones and stuff like that, it's very easy to hide one's those type of biases if that makes sense. So well yeah, what's your thoughts on this? Because I don't know if you've spoke to because I'm still remunerating with the whole um like tackling the like the pornification of society. I don't know. That's why I don't really talk too much about
About porn. No, I mean, I have
porn
not,
addiction and
I do
stuff.
not know too much about it. I've only heard about the psychological, the destructive impacts. I've seen friends' marriages being destroyed by it.
Okay,
I
the
mean,
psychological
yeah. So when we're talking about this as being, as you, what was the topic here? It was a predictor of divorce because that trust cannot, more often than not, I think, be rebuilt.
so it's the trust. I like what you said. So it's the trust element, right?
And also, but then again, it depends on what kind of pornography, right? And that's a whole other, that is a topic on its own, right? So, you know, this couple was willing to work on it because it wasn't like extreme porn, but it was the whole fact that during their family life,
Mhm.
while she was putting the children to bed, for example, or something, the husband was indulging on his phone. And that's the kind of thing which is absolute poison to a marriage. And it was ultimately destroyed.
I think what you said is actually more concise and better than what I said. It's the trust. It's not really the okay. And the reason I think it's important that even we hone in on that. So, for example, you mentioned like the example you gave. It's the betrayal of the trust, and once that's gone, it can be very difficult. Now, if, for example, instead of watching porn, like when the woman is putting the child to bed, like you said, he's flirting or he's um liking different women on IG or having conversations, that could also lead to betrayal or trust, and that could also end the marriage as well. Similarly, if a woman feels that way, another woman might not see that as such a big issue because there's no physical. My point in using that as an example is that is it porn in and of itself, or is it the breakdown of the trust, the betrayal?
I think
That
it,
is
I
the
would say it's both. If a person identifies as a religious couple, a religious woman, for
yeah
example, whatever you could say is the on the other side, right? Then it's devastating, you know, because we're not talking about like
yeah.
there are certain couples, non-Muslim, who are polyamorous and that type of thing. It's well, whatever. But if this is like fundamentally, it's like, what does this mean for you in terms of your character? Like, how can I respect you as a man? So it's that, and then it's about our relationship or how this is impacting our intimate life and the children, what kind of an example you are. So it's like, it's so deep. And there's a lot of resentment and anger that goes with that, of course. It's, I mean, it's just devastating. So,
I
yeah.
think that point as well should be expanded upon for men because I don't think a lot of men view it that way. So, like what you said, in a sense of how the woman might view it, in a sense of like looking at his character, what type of man are you? You're raising a child. If I'm honest with you, I don't think a lot of men view porn consumption like that. As in, they wouldn't view if a man is watching porn, what does that say about his character? What does that say about his yes, obviously his religiosity, because you're going clearly going against you're violating Allah's laws. But in terms of that, how you and I've heard that as well from a number of women. This is why I think it's important that obviously men hear women's perspective and likewise women hear men's perspective. A lot of men don't view porn consumption to that degree. That's also what might be a problem that he might not think, oh, this is not really a big deal. I'm just doing it to just so avoiding you because you won't like it. But does that reflect negatively on my character? Does that mean, some men I'm maybe quite oblivious to how their spouse views porn consumption.
Mhm. I mean, I think that ultimately it's just a general ethical and moral breakdown internationally that,
Like, yes.
like, as a woman, I would perceive that as being very juvenile. It's very juvenile because when a man has that self-control, that hilm, that forbearance, that's very attractive. That's a very manly quality, you know, and it's just that generally there's just like a breakdown because we live in a land of easy nafs indulgence, right? So we have this smartphone where whatever you want is at your fingertips, and even if you don't want to see it, it ends up being there on your feed, And it takes a person with real, like a very strong moral compass to turn that off.
Correct. No, correct. No, I agree. I'm not disputing what
Yeah,
you're saying, but
no,
I was watching a documentary about I think it was on BBC. They were talking about they were interviewing I think like three or four. I don't know if they'll class themselves as porn addicts, but they watched a lot of porn. And one of them was actually a Muslim woman. Now her reasons for not watching porn or why she felt guilty was a shame and stuff that was attached to it. But what was interesting with the men, there was like I think two or three men. It's only when they saw the exploitation of the women at the porn because they were just oh they're liberated, they enjoy it, whatever. That's when they felt guilty and realized actually I don't feel like I can partake in watches because I'm contributing to a woman being exploited. So they needed to see it from that perspective to realize actually I don't want to partake in this anymore. And for me, what was really interesting is that people have got different triggers, like in the sense of why they would stop or become more moral, ethical. There's some people that naturally from the get-go is like, I shouldn't be partaking and consuming this. Others, or like oftentimes you find with a number of men, it's only when they have a daughter and they realize, oh, I wouldn't want that to happen to my daughter. But then for me, the question is, okay, so it's because you've got a daughter now. Now you see the humanity in other women, and then is it really the case that you see the humanity in women, or is it just because you don't want that to be done to your daughter? So really, it's because you don't want an extension of yourself, which is your daughter, to be harmed. That's why now you're very somewhat protective and moral and upright. So for me, is it that you're really moral and upright for the sake of the woman, or for the sake of yourself? So that's why, yeah. But what you said, I find that.
hmm. What
Um,
what you did ask me what was my take on porn. I really don't know much about the topic other than years ago I read a book recommended by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf called The Empire of Illusion by Chris Hedges. That was so disturbing, immensely disturbing. But that alone, it highlights behind the scenes what happens and
yeah, that's my point. Yeah,
right,
yeah,
exactly. So that
yeah.
alone, like
That's
any person, any man with some kind of like moral backbone that would read that chapter in that book would that
yeah.
would suffice, I think.